What's up developers, and welcome back to a new video where we will be diving into the query builder. Quick pause. Do you want to support the channel and want me to continue on creating content? Well, you can support the channel on Patreon right now, where you get benefits such as a private Discord group where you can share your coding issues and other developers will help you out. If you are interested to join, the link will be in the description down below. We have finally reached the fun part of this Laravel course where we will be interacting with our database, since we've already created dummy data. The power of Laravel is its object relational mapper, which is Eloquent. Eloquent, its primary focus is simplicity, where it allows you to interact with your database in a super simple method. We could dive straight into Eloquent, but I want to take it a step back and focus on the query builder in Laravel first, which is the core of Laravel's database functionality. Laravel's query builder is a fluent interface, meaning that it uses method chaining to make it as easy as possible. We've already talked about method chaining, but in short, it allows you to chain methods after each other when applying multiple operations. Most of Laravel's database interactions happen right inside of the controller, whether it is the query builder or Eloquent. So let's close off all the tabs that we have open right now. Let's navigate to the root of a directory, and let me close off my config, and let's open the posts controller file. Let's navigate to the index method where our magic will happen in this video. Whenever you want to interact with your database through the query builder, you got to make use of the database facade, which is used to chain raw queries. So let's go right above our return statement, and let's define a new variable called post, because we're going to get all posts from the database. And let's set it equal to, in capital, DB. The first use statement is the illuminate support facade DB, so let's hit enter and pull it in. And a facade is basically a class that provides simple access to code functionalities. Now all facades are stored right inside of the illuminate support facades namespace, where they use static methods to access non-static resources. Whenever you want to access methods from the facade, you need to add a double set of colon right after the facade class, where you then can make a call to a method inside of it. In our case, we're going to start performing a raw SQL command that can be performed through the statement method. What this allows us to do, so the DB statement, is passing in a string inside the statement method that we have of a raw query statement. So let's test it out. In single quotes, let's say select star, so everything from the post table. Let's output our variable that we have called posts right here, right below of it. So let's define a DD, so a die dump, where we're going to simply pass in posts. Let's save it, and let's navigate back to Google Chrome. Let's refresh our /blog endpoint. And as you can see, it has returned a boolean saying true, so the query can be performed. Whenever you want to select rows from the database, it's better to work with the select method rather than the statement method. So let's replace everything from statement with select. And what we're going to select is, once again, everything from the table posts. Save, and let's navigate back, refresh it, and this is the output that we need. We have a total of 202 rows, and if we open them, we have ID number 1, title of post number 1, and the rest of the data. Now at the moment, we returned a collection of a std class object. It isn't visible inside a DD, so let's quickly replace our DD with a var_dump. Save it, and let's navigate back, refresh it. As you could see, we have an array with objects inside of it of the std class. So let's navigate back and undo what we just did, so get our DD back. And an important topic in coding in general is parameter binding, or basically prepared statements. Since Laravel works with PDO, we can do it in a super simple way. We first need to change up our query, since we still want to select everything from the post table, but we need a where clause, so where the ID is equal to 1. This should return 1 row. So let's save it and navigate back, refresh it, we have 1 row. This isn't the most preferred way. If we imagine that the 1 that we have right here is user input, you do want to kind of prevent potential SQL attacks. So what we can do is replacing the 1 with a question mark. Then we can add a second parameter, so comma, space, which will be an array. Inside the array, we need to pass in our static ID of 1. I'm not going to explain why and how this works, because this is something you should be familiar with when you start off with Laravel. If we save it and navigate back, refresh it, you'll see that the output is exactly the same, but we use prepared statements right here. A question mark will be messy at times when working with multiple parameters, so you can also name them by replacing the question mark with a colon ID. Then inside our second parameter, we can't just pass in a 1 because we got to pass in a key value pair. The key will be equal to the parameter name, so ID, access operator or a pointer with a value of 1. If we save it and navigate back, refresh it, you'll see that the output is still the same. Next to selecting values from the database, you obviously have the chance to persist data into the database, and the query looks pretty similar. By the way, the SQL keywords that we're using here, so select, from, and where, are not case sensitive. I'm just used to capitals when working with my SQL, so that's why I'm using it. Now we're not going to select data right now because we're going to persist it with the insert method. Then we're going to perform a simple insert query right here. So insert into the table posts, parentheses, because we need to define the columns, which are title, excerpt, body, image underscore path, is underscore published, and the minutes to read. Then we need to define the values, so the value method. And what we're going to do is adding question marks again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then once again, right after our single quote, let's add a comma, array, hit enter. Right here, we don't need to define key value pairs because it will find the first match, second match, third match, fourth match, and so on. So let's say test, 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 and true for the is published, and 1 for the minutes to read. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you will indeed see that the return value is true, meaning that 1 row has been inserted to the database. If we navigate back to our database client, open our post table, and let's say that we want to select the third column, you'll see that the last row is the one that we just added. Updating rows works pretty much in the same exact way. Let's navigate back to our post controller and let's actually remove everything until the insert method. Alright, because we're going to update something. You might be familiar with the query, so we're going to update the post table. We're going to set the body equal to a value, so let's say question mark, where the ID is equal to a question mark, so a prepared statement. Now let's add our second parameter of an array, hit enter. Now the body will be body2, where the ID will be 203. So that's the last row that we have. Save it, navigate back, refresh the page. And as you could see, the return value is 1, meaning that 1 row has been edited. Let's navigate back to our database client. Let's run it. As you could see, body has been updated to body2. The last operation is deleting a row, so basically row 203. Let's navigate back to Visual Studio Code. Let's open the post controller and let's just rewrite the entire query. Let's say delete. The query will be delete from the post table where the ID is equal to a question mark. Second parameter, brackets, the ID is 203. Save it, navigate back to Chrome, refresh the page. Whoops, I double refreshed that. If we check the post table, run it, you'll see that 203 is gone. These were the most basic operations of the query builder. Let's dive into a bit more complex ones, which is by chaining methods to the query builder itself. Whenever you want to chain methods, you have to use another method than delete. So let's delete it again. And what we're going to use is the table method right here. Within the table method, we have to define one simple string, which will be the table name inside our database. In our case, it will be the posts table. If we're trying to perform the current query, let's test it out. You'll see a lot of results inside our die dump, but this is actually not the correct one. There's not really data inside of it, as you could see. The issue that we have right here is that we're not triggering the execution of the current query. In order to do that, we got to make sure that we chain our first simple method to it, which will be the get method. So right after our query, let's add an access operator, get. If we save it, navigate back to the browser and refresh it, you'll see that our collection with 202 items have been returned to the browser. When it comes to multiple methods that you're trying to chain, I usually prefer to put the chaining method on the line below. Right now, we're chaining it on the same line. So let's go right in front of the access operator of get, hit enter and hit tab. And let's actually hit enter one more time, because the get method should always be placed at the end of the query builder, since it will be executed based on the get method. Now on the line above, we should be able to add another method right here. And I want to cover the most used ones in this episode. So let's start off with the easiest one, which is the select method. With the select method, you're simply going to tell your query that you want to select a certain column from your table posts. So let's say that we only want to select the title. If we save it, navigate back, refresh it, you'll see that the output is exactly the same. But if we open one item, you'll see that we only selected the title. You could obviously select multiple columns since the select method does accept multiple values. So right after our title, let's add a comma and let's say the body. Save it, navigate back, refresh it, open our array, we have our title and our body. Within MySQL, you can perform the where clause in order to limit the amount of rows that are being returned, which pretty much works in the same exact way. Now let's remove our entire select because we don't need it, and let's chain the where method to it. At the moment, it's giving us an error because it takes 2 required parameters and 1 optional. The first one is the column you're trying to perform the where clause on. So let's say in single quotes, we want to select all values based on the ID. Then the second parameter will be the comparison operator. So let's say that we want to select everything with a greater than sign. And the third one is obviously the value, which will be 50. So in our case, we're going to get all values where the ID is greater than 50. If we save it and navigate to the browser, refresh the page, you'll see that we have an array of 152 items, which is correct because it skipped the first 50. If we open item 1, you see that the starting ID is 51. A pretty cool feature that I like in Laravel is the fact that it recognizes that booleans are either true or false. So it's kind of a waste to use the equal sign right here as your comparison operator. So let's remove it. Let's save it and navigate back, refresh it. We selected one array where the ID is equal to 50. So it kind of knows, all right, we're selecting the ID, and if we skip the comparison operator, it sets a default of is equal to 50. Now back to the booleans, it pretty much works in the same way. So let's say that the is published is equal to true. Save it, refresh it. We have 200 arrays. It skipped the first 2 because ID is number 3. Navigate to our post table and let's go to our ID number 1 and 2. We have a is published of 0, which is false. Now, what if you have multiple conditions, which is something that happened quite a lot? Well, it's actually super easy because you simply need to add a new where method to it. So let's say that we want to check where the ID is greater than, let's say, 50 again. Save it. Refresh it, we have 52 rows, where the ID number 1 is actually 51. It also allows you to select a certain range of rows where the value is between 2 values. So let's remove both where methods, and let's define the whereBetween method. The first required parameter will be the column name, so let's say the minutes to read. The second parameter will be an array, so let's define that, where the minutes to read are between, let's say, 2 minutes, comma, 6 minutes. So we're simply going to select all posts that we have, where the minutes to read is between 2 and 6. Let's navigate back, refresh it. Apparently, that's a total of 105. And if we open a couple, you see that the starting point is 2, 2 again. And I don't even think that they are all static. Oh, no, all right. We've got 5 as well. You could also select the inverse, so pretty much every row in the database where the minutes to read is not between 2 and 6. We simply need to replace whereBetween with whereNotBetween. If we save it and navigate back, we have a total of 97 rows. You can also return rows where a column value is in a selected list of options. So let's replace whereNotBetween with whereIn, and let's say 2, 6, and 8. Save it. Let's navigate back, refresh it, and right here you'll see that we have a total of 59 rows where the minutes to read is 2, 6, or 8. And if we open a couple, you can only see 2, 8, or 6. There is another where method that we could use, which is the whereNull and whereNotNull methods. Both methods will check whether a selected column has a null or not null value inside of it. So at the moment, we don't have any null values. So what we can do is right-clicking on our, let's say, excerpt of ID number 1, open the edit dialog, let's remove the excerpt, and let's update it. Alright, as you can see, it's null right now. Let's navigate back to our post controller. Let's remove the whereIn method, where we're going to chain the whereNull method. It accepts one parameter, which will be the column that you want to check. In our case, it's obviously excerpt. Save it, navigate back, refresh it. Now the output is 1, which is correct, which should be ID number 1, where the excerpt is null. But if we change it to whereNotNull, refresh the page, you'll see that we have 201 items. The first one starts with ID number 1 because the excerpt is not empty. A common method that you will also perform quite a lot is the distinct method, where you will select rows with unique values. For that, we got to make sure that we chain 2 methods to it. The first one is the select method. So let's replace the whereNotNull with the select method, since we got to select distinct values from a specific table. And I actually think that the minutes to read table is the best example right here, since the values are simple integers between 1 and 10. Then right after our select method, let's chain another method to it, which is the, let's say, distinct method. It doesn't require any parameters because it will look for unique values inside the minutes to read table. So let's refresh it. And as you can see, we've got a total of 10 rows, which is pretty obvious because the numbers can only be between 1 and 10. The reason why we're using the distinct method together with the select method is the fact that by default, the distinct method will look for the primary key of a table. Now obviously, primary keys of our table are unique, so there's no point of selecting distinct values of the ID column. If we remove our select, refresh it, it basically selects all values because every ID is unique. Next to all the constraining methods that we just performed, we could also perform methods to modify data, which will basically change the way data is outputted inside the browser. The most common method is probably the orderBy method, which will either order a table based on a column in ascending, so from low to high, or descending fashion, so from high to low. So let's remove the distinct method, and let's chain the orderBy method. We're going to order it based on the ID. It accepts a second parameter, which will be the type of sort. We don't need to write down the entire word, but we just need to write down the shortcut. So let's say DESC of descending. There's actually no point of adding ascending right here, so ASC, because by default, data is sorted in an ascending fashion. Save it, refresh it, open our array. You see that the last ID, which is 202. When you want to work with custom pagination and not the pagination that Laravel offers, you usually will work with the skip and take method. So let's remove the orderBy method again. And let's chain the skip method, which accepts a required parameter because you get to define how many rows you want to skip before selecting values. So let's say that we want to skip the first 30 rows. Then on the line below, we got to define the take method, since we need to define the amount of rows we want to select or take inside the take method. So let's say 10. If we save it, refresh the page, open the items array, we have 10 rows. The first one is ID number 31 up until ID number 40. When you're making a game or you want to shuffle values that you're selecting from the database, you could simply chain the inRandomOrder method to it. So let's do that. Let's remove the skip and take, and let's add the inRandomOrder method to it. If we save it and navigate back, refresh it, open item 1, random ID of 100, we have 117. 125, and 45 right in front of it. Now the last section of this video will be dedicated to returning methods, which will stop the query chain and trigger the execution of a SQL query. Either one of the following methods that we're going to cover right now needs to be chained right after your query builder, replaced with the get method. Otherwise, your return value or values will always just be an instance of the query builder and not the actual value. We've already covered the most common one, which is obviously the get method to get values. Then we got the first method, which will get the first result. It's pretty much the same method as the get method, except it has a limit of 1. If we save it and navigate back, refresh the page, you'll see that the output is one single row where the limit is 1. So it's pretty much the first match it finds, which is ID number 1. But you could perform a where method right in front of it. So let's do that. Let's say where. We're going to select ID number 100. Save it, navigate back, refresh the page. You'll see that we selected ID number 100. Now this can actually be done a lot easier, because we can remove both methods and we can simply chain the find method to it, which will look for a row based on the primary key of the post table, which needs to be passed right inside of it. So let's say 100, save it, refresh it, and the output is still the same. Another interesting method is the value method. So let's say value, and let's remove 100. All right, which will grab one specific value from a row based on a condition. So let's pass in a column of body. So we're going to grab all body values, or just one, because we're going to chain the where method where the ID is 100. Save it. Let's navigate back, refresh it, and we printed out the body of ID number 100. If we remove the where clause, you'll see that we selected the body of post number 1. So it basically checks the first match it finds. A very interesting method is the count method. In plain PHP, you usually do this inside your code, but what you can do is replacing value with count. You don't need to pass in a parameter because it simply shows the count of all rows that you have inside your database. But you could also perform a condition right here. So let's say that we want to select a count where the ID is greater than 50 again. If we refresh it, you'll see that the output is 152. We have the option to return the minimum and maximum value of a column by replacing all methods that we have with min, but we do need to define the column. So let's say minutes to read. Save it, refresh it, and the minutes to read is obviously, well, the minimum value is obviously 1, and the maximum value is 10. Finally, we got the sum. So let's say the sum of minutes to read is 1039. So on average, a user needs 1039 minutes to read all blog posts, while the average of a blog post, so AVG, is equal to 5 minutes and 14 seconds. This was it for this video where I showed you the most common query builder methods that you could perform. There are actually a lot of more methods, but I don't want to show you how you could insert, update, and delete data through the query builder, because it will mess up one of the next videos where we dive into Eloquent. And Eloquent is actually the most preferred way of handling all the things that we just did. If you are interested in the rest, you should simply refer to the official documentation of Laravel, which I will link in the description down below. In the next video, we will shift our focus a little bit more towards the front end, because we will be doing something with the data that we're selecting right here. If you do like my content and you want to see more, leave this video a thumbs up. And if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button.